signs, as opposed to having to select it from a menu and then cast it. But again, with PC hotkeys, I never really noticed much of a difference here. They also added a default map filter that filters out a lot of the more superfluous map markers that are associated with something this game is known for, which is more than a fair share of filler, such as all sorts of just little loot caches being marked on your map, which honestly can get a little annoying after a while. So they added a proper filter to the map to specifically exclude those things, but all of the previous options are still there, so if you're like myself and still prefer the all option, you can do that. They also adjusted the height at which you'll take falling damage, meaning that you can fall a little farther without dying, which was the cause of no small amount of annoying deaths. You can now walk up to herbs and instantly loot them, so you'll walk up to an herb, interact with it, and it'll just add it to your inventory rather than opening up a loot window that you then have to confirm through, which is a small change, but honestly over the course of the playthrough was really nice, alongside a few other quality of life changes. Now, probably one of the bigger things gameplay-wise that I think might be of note to a lot of people is their addition of a full combat rebalance mod, though it's important to note that they did not implement this one for one. They took the core of it with some elements being tweaked farther or omitted entirely. So for the people who didn't like the default combat of the game, even that was touched by this next-gen update. And that's to say nothing of the camera changes, etc. that make the feel of the game a little bit different as well. And I can pretty much vouch for all of those various changes. The next-gen update is quite good, outside of course, some annoying crashes, and the fact that, honestly, just design-wise, I think this one's starting to show its age a bit. But let's get into that. When you first fire up a game, you're going to need to pick a difficulty, as the game has 4 of them: Story, Normal, Blood and Bones, or Death March. Now, personally, I would not recommend playing this game on anything less than Blood and Broken Bones. And that is because what changes here is enemy health and damage primarily, and because of this, if you have the game on Story or Normal, you can pretty much safely ignore significant game mechanics that, yes, make the game trivially easy, but also make it very unengaging at the same time, and because of that, I prefer those harder difficulties where you're kind of forced to use your Witcher potions, bombs, etc., and actively engage with the system a little more. But we'll talk more about that later. Now, I do also want to mention that Death March in general isn't that bad once you get past the initial portion of the game, but you can occasionally get swarmed by enemies, and on Death March, basically everything hits like a truck, and until you have a way to effectively manage those crowds, it can lead to some very annoying deaths early on, so be sure to save often if you go that route, but it's definitely very doable. I've even got a build that I'm using in this video, but also it's just a build I made years and years ago that I will also try to link in the description below if you're curious, that I personally used for Death March. But with that out of the way, let's talk about what is certainly going to be the biggest portion of this video, which is the story. Now, what I'm not going to do here is give an absolute play-by-play of every single quest, but I am going to talk significant spoilers for the story of The Witcher 3, because it's been out for almost 10 years, and also, there's just a lot of stuff I want to comment and talk about. But in particular, the first thing I want to mention is that one thing I actually don't like about The Witcher 3 as someone who was a big fan of the series before this game even launched was that it did very little to carry forward your choices from the second game. In fact, for those who don't know, The Witcher 2 had 16 different endings, and barely any of that matters for The Witcher 3 at all. And while I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, because, at the end of the day, you gotta zig or zag and pick a direction for the sequel, totally fine with that in concept, so they narrowed it down to a few specific choices in The Witcher 2 that could have an impact on 3. But, unfortunately, the actual impact of those choices on The Witcher 3 is also incredibly minimal. So, despite you being able to simulate a save from the second game and talk about which choices you made, not a lot of them have a huge impact on the game directly, with really, I would say, the biggest one being whether or not you save or spared Letho. You'll get a bunch of extra scenes with him, but the rest honestly doesn't matter much, with a lot of the important characters either being killed off screen or simply not being in the game at all. So while I think The Witcher 3 does a lot of cool things, just right out of the gate I was disappointed with the approach it took to carrying forward some of those world changes. Though I do recognize realistically 16 endings was way too much to keep track of, and they were going to have to pare that down and pick a sort of canonical way to move forward. And I don't really think The Witcher 3 is worse for any of these choices, it's just disappointing, frankly. But let's properly kick it off. Now, if you choose to play through the tutorial of the game, which you might want to do because it introduces Ciri if you haven't read the books and have no idea who she is, as she doesn't really feature in the first 2 games at all, but she is part of the tutorial here, where she is a young lady training at the castle of Kaer Morhen with the other Witchers, and you use this opportunity to familiarize yourself with the controls, get a sense of Geralt's fatherly relationship to Ciri, and it's a decent opener. But before too long, the wild hunt comes before you wake up and realize this was actually a dream, and we're left with Geralt and Vesemir having a conversation just outside White Orchard. This is where the game tells us that Geralt has fully recovered his memory, is tracking down Yennefer, who has sent him a letter finally, but the town we were supposed to meet her at was destroyed, and thus we are trying to find her elsewhere, and we're going to go ask around at the inn. Now, the whole sequence of White Orchard here is like a 5 to 10 hour segment, depending on how quickly you play, that introduces a whole lot of concepts. Basically, the Empire of Nilfgaard has invaded, is occupying lands around the northern kingdoms, with their presence being either tolerated or hated by certain individuals, bit of a mixed bag there. And we're going to meet with Nilfgaardian commanders, the locals, get all sorts of a feel for this. But your main goal in White Orchard is to kill a griffin that's been terrorizing the locals, in exchange for information about where Yennefer is and went, but probably also worth a mention that you'll meet a merchant named Gaunter O'Dim who helps you in your pursuit of this, and that's going to come up later. Just a nice bit of foreshadowing there. Eventually, though, you'll have killed this griffin, you'll get the information on Yennefer, only to cause a bit of a scene at the local inn. Right after, Yennefer finds you. She tells you that while it's nice to see you, you have a meeting with Emperor Emhyr, who has a task for you that you're definitely going to want to hear about. This is your first time meeting Yennefer since you regained your memories properly, and she seems to have been doing a bit better than you, quite frankly. But either way, you're off to the palace at Vizima, which has been conquered, so you can meet the Emperor. This is where you're going to run into the Wild Hunt, the subtitle for the game as it turns out, who are very much so after Yennefer here, but you're able to thwart them at the cost of your Nilfgaardian escort before arriving at the palace. Now, this part of the game is where you can choose to make a bunch of choices based on what you did in The Witcher 2, in terms of how it matters for The Witcher 3, which you can do by simply answering some questions. From here, we meet Emhyr, who tells us that he's found a bunch of leads on Ciri, the young woman who is effectively Geralt's daughter, and that she's seemingly resurfaced after having been missing for quite some time, which due to the powers of her elder blood, making her known as the Lady of Time and Space, able to teleport and manipulate time and space, makes her a difficult lady to track down. Thus, after having a bunch of fresh leads, Emhyr sends for the best Witcher around, Geralt of Rivia, to track down his daughter, whom he has a very personal reason for doing so, with Emhyr making clear that he wants Ciri brought to him specifically. Emhyr, though, as you might have guessed, is a pretty terrible father, and neither you nor Ciri are going to be particularly fond of the guy. From here, we can have a proper conversation with Yennefer, who can give you a little more information in terms of what she actually looks like these days, and also sets about giving us our proper leads that make up the game's 3 primary chapters. Basically, she tells us who to talk to where. We can go to Velen and look for a Nilfgaardian spy known as Hendrik in a village, track down Triss Merigold in Novigrad, and meet up with Yennefer herself finally in Skellige, which is technically the order you would approach most of these quests, as that's sort of the natural level curve to it. Now, right after this conversation, you get a good insight via an optional conversation into the state of the war, because Nilfgaard invaded the northern kingdoms after the end of the second game. No matter what happens, that invasion happens, and we can get the current events here. Basically, Nilfgaard invaded, had tremendous initial success thanks to the events of the second game, right up until winter finally came. At which point, there were 2 kingdoms left in the northern kingdoms to conquer, Redania and Kedwen. Redania being ruled by Radovid, who has, since the first game, become more and more of a despot, and Kedwen, which is on the weakened side. So, Nilfgaard, having to wait until winter was over, basically, to continue their offensive, had paused of sorts, and instead of doing nothing, Redania marched across the mountains and basically attacked and conquered Kedwin themselves, but due to the loss of their king, was quickly brought under control and assimilated into Redania's systems, and this allowed them to form a united front against the ongoing Nilfgaard invasion, which is where the most recent events come in. Basically, in springtime, once the battles resumed, there was a particularly large clash in the area of Velen, otherwise known as No Man's Land, which makes up the first segment of the main story. This was a massive battle that nobody really won. Losses on each side were enormous, to the point where Nilfgaard was forced to basically form defensive lines and simply stop advancing, and Redania was forced to retreat across the river and do much of the same. So as it stands when the game begins, Nilfgaard is waiting for reinforcements from the south so they can bolster their troops following those losses and regain the offensive against Redania, which is also licking its wounds at this point, meaning that the war has ground to a bit of a standstill, which is where we can make for No Man's Land ourselves, or Velen, which is where the game starts getting much better, as up to this point it's mostly just been a lot of exposition around setting things up, explaining where things stand. And now it feels like you can actually start progressing the story a little bit. So right away, Velen is a bleak and dreary place in every sense of the word. It was the site of that massive battle. As I mentioned, death and despair is everywhere. There's a famine, there's a plague. People are not doing well here is the key thing to note, and that is reflected in basically everything. Now, our job in Velen initially is to track down that Nilfgaardian spy we were told to find, known as Hendrik. We ask around at a local inn for him, get pointed to the town he's supposed to live in, only to go there and find that it has been pretty thoroughly destroyed. There was one survivor, however, who informs us that it was none other than the Wild Hunt that did this, but after rifling through his things, we can find two leads, a local witch and the Bloody Baron. You see, Nilfgaard, having had to retreat and lick its wounds, as I mentioned, has installed a sort of local leader in the area known as the Bloody Baron, who is effectively ruling the area. And we'll get to him in a moment, because first I want to talk about Kiera, or the local witch, which just so happens to be a witch Geralt has met plenty of time previously, as she was a member of King Foltest of Vizima's court, and you can inform her that you're here looking for Ciri. She'll explain that she obviously hasn't seen her, but would know if she had, but what she has encountered was a strange elven mage who led her to a dark cavern of sorts, where he was supposed to be staying. You can travel with her to go explore this ruin, which is where you'll encounter more of the Wild Hunt, and specifically their navigators, because the Wild Hunt is not some generic roving party, but rather they are a band of elves from an entirely different world that has come here seeking Ciri and her power, so they can escape what is known as the White Frost, or the Apocalypse, basically. Their navigators are how they travel between worlds, and it's clear that they came here in search of that elven mage. We can track this down, we find out that the elven mage was working with Ciri in some way, and that she encountered some local entities known as the Crones. This is pretty much all of the main story stuff for Kiera, but she does have an optional side quest afterwards that can see you helping her solve a local curse that can lead to some things where you can send her to Kaer Morhen later, which can help you in a separate quest much later on, and it's also some pretty good side content. But main story, that's pretty much it for her involvement. Now, your other lead here is none other than the Baron, which honestly is some of the best storytelling that The Witcher 3 has to offer. Now, like a great many people, the Baron aims to use Geralt to further his own ends in exchange for information, as it turns out, because the Baron's pretty direct. Ciri was absolutely here relatively recently, after she showed up, clearly exhausted and wounded, following a somewhat harrowing ordeal, it would seem. But in order to tell us where Ciri actually went, the Baron enlists us to find his missing wife and daughter. But things over the course of this investigation turned pretty dark, as we learned that the reason that his wife and daughter left is that the Baron himself was an abusive drunk and they planned to escape, though it's actually not that simple. But the story at this point wants you to believe that that is what happened, and that in particular, his wife miscarried. A miscarriage that was buried improperly and became what is known as a botchling, which is a truly disturbing part of the story, to be honest. But you need to solve this using your Witcher trade, that is to say, our propensity to hunt and track down monsters, which I'm sure many people know by now, to sort this issue out. You have two options. You can either kill the botchling outright, using its blood with a ritual to then track down his wife and daughter, or you can go about removing the curse of what the botchling is and turn it into a lubberkin instead, which is a sort of guardian spirit, which is one of, I would say, the initial choices the game has you make, though it doesn't have a ton of impact on much besides this quest. Now, no matter what you choose there, you're going to find out a bit of information here, mostly that the Baron's daughter has ran off to nearby Oxenfurt and joined the witch hunters there, and as such is a member of the Church of Eternal Fire, the local religion, and she has no plans of going back to her abusive father, which leaves us with needing to find out where the Baron's wife is. We do this by tracking down the crones that were mentioned as the Kira side of this. The crones are probably one of the most memorable portions of the Witcher 3 period, as they are the extremely cruel guardians of Velen that live in a nearby swamp. So we're going to need to track them down, and this is going to lead you to a small village of orphans in the middle of the swamp, being cared for by a much older lady. Now, we're still looking for Ciri when we meet these ladies, so that's who we're asking about, and this puts us on the trail of a nearby godling, and we can help him recover his voice, and he will then help us compel this older grandmother to give us a meeting with the ladies of the wood, or the crones. The crones basically say, do a task for us and then we'll tell you what you want to know, and send us off to a nearby village to present a dagger to a villager. This villager is the one giving us our task to help with, though, and he requests that we go to a nearby tree and exorcise it of an evil spirit, which is where we start to get a real sense of how messed up things happen to be here. You see, the tree spirit, once you find it, is actually the spirit of an old druid that has been trapped in this tree by the crones. If you save him, he promises to help you and save the kids at that swamp village that are in trouble, according to him, or you can choose to kill it as the crones requested, and this actually turns out to be a bigger choice than you might initially think. Now, unfortunately, the consequences for this decision are a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. It's kind of really dark either way, and I think it's one of those decisions where The Witcher 3 is at its best. There really isn't a correct decision here. If you do what the crones want you to do, all of those kids in the swamp village die. If you free this spirit, it goes on to destroy an entire village all on its own and leads to some really dark consequences later on, outside of just the immediate results. Either way, once this is done, the villager that sent you here will cut off his ear and tell you to present it to the crones, and once you do this, the crones will appear in their appropriately ghastly visages, explaining that Ciri was here but eventually escaped after they tried to eat her, or at least were planning on doing so, which is how she got to the Baron's company to begin with. But it's a little more complicated than that still, because over the course of this investigation, and specifically right at this moment that you're having this conversation, is where you'll likely make the connection, or at least Garrett will for sure, that the older woman taking care of the orphans in this village is actually the Baron's missing wife. She made a pact with the crones where they would rid her of her unwanted pregnancy in exchange for a period of service. They obviously twisted the nature of this bargain, and she's compelled to stay here. Now we can take this information back to the Baron, who will finally tell us what's going on with Ciri, which is simply that she fled from here up north to Novigrad, which makes up the next leg of the main story. But we're not quite done here yet, because if you've talked to the Baron a bit more here, or simply explain what's going on with his wife now, you'll learn that this isn't really a one-sided thing on the Baron's side. You see, while he was very much so an abusive drunk, his wife also wasn't a good person, and has tried to murder him several times after she cheated on him while he was away at war, and it's a very dark, messed up story. But obviously it doesn't end here, because the sort of after story wrap up is that you can choose to help the Bloody Baron here go try to rescue his wife, and if you do this, his daughter will also show up with the Church of the Eternal Fire trying to do the same thing. Technically not part of the main story, but that particular area of it wraps up the main plot threads of Velen in a very appropriate way. Now, depending on the choices you made, there will be some extra consequences in terms of what happens to the Bloody Baron and his family, but overall, it's just the best part of this story, and it's extremely well done. I like this initial area a lot, and it sets up the game extremely well in a very dark and depressing way. Also worth a mention before we move on to Novigrad, that before you leave, like right before you leave the Baron, you'll encounter under what is known as Uma, or the ugliest man alive, which is a creature under some sort of curse. You're not exactly sure about the what or why, but that's important and we'll circle back to it later, and that's pretty much all the game tells you right now. Which brings us north to Novigrad, the free city, as it were, which has thus far resisted both Nilfgaard's efforts and Redania's efforts at conquering the area, valuing its freedom overall. And like a great many human settlements in times of uneasiness, has turned to persecuting the odd and the strange. In this particular regard, they are burning mages and everything magical at the stake, and Novigrad is a real bad place to be a mage right now, which makes it perhaps no surprise then that we are trying to meet up with Triss Merigold, one of Geralt's former lovers, who also has a vested interest in helping us find Ciri. Now, upon arriving and being greeted with the information about the mages I've already shared, we'll go try to find Triss's house, only to find it being looted and that witch hunters don't like you either as a witcher. But we can also learn that in order to find Triss, we've got to look for the Putrid Grove, as it's called, or a haven for beggars and the like, which after a short quest we can find Triss Merigold here doing favors for the King of Beggars, as he's known, or one of the gang's crime lords, and after assisting Triss a little bit with this, she can point us in the direction of an Oniromancer, or a sort of dream mage who can show you visions, and after some quests in this regard, we can be pointed towards Dandelion, who was apparently helping Ciri, but the problem is when you go to the Rosemary and Thyme, Dandelion's recently inherited property, we find out that Dandelion is actually missing. We don't know where he is, and thus he can't really help us find Ciri despite knowing that he was in contact with her. This is where we'll meet up with Zoltan, who can explain the situation with Dandelion a little better, and this, unfortunately, is the portion of the main story that I personally like the least. I just don't think it's super fun, and while there's a couple of good quests in here, we spend a lot of time simply tracking down various leads and looking into things, and it's overall just not as compelling, as you kind of know what the outcome here is already. In following Velen, it's very tonally different, because there we were stuck in swamps and dreariness, whereas Novigrad is a proper urban environment with a big city to explore, and even outside of town here, it's more like fields and farms and that type of thing, so it's a very different situation, and I can see why they went with it, but it doesn't come across to me as nearly as interesting as the initial chapter of the game. But basically, we need to track down Dandelion's last known whereabouts, which is going to lead us to a woman he is familiar with known as Priscilla. Priscilla explains that Dandelion and Ciri were involved in some sort of heist that has clearly gone wrong because Dandelion is now missing. We, of course, need to find a way to help him, but Priscilla in particular informs us that the Big Four, or the criminal underworld, is all looking for Dandelion, which is why we're going to go meet them, and it turns out we happen to know one of them, as one of them is Dijkstra, the former spy master for Redania, turned criminal gang lord. And it turns out they're all looking for one of their number, known as Whoreson Jr., who we know for a fact was involved in a spat with Dandelion up to this point, just before he sends men to attack the rest of the crime bosses here, which means that they all want to find him and kill him as well, and he's also our best lead as to where Dandelion is, so we need to track him down as well. In following those quests, we can learn that Junior there is actually working with the Redanians, and they likely know where he is. Now, through the grapevine, we can find that our old friend Vernon Roach is likely also counting Radovid among his allies, and we can go meet up with Roach, who played a big role in the second game as well, if you don't know. And he's due to meet with a Redanian contact who can hopefully point us in the direction of Junior. That contact turns out to be none other than King Radovid himself, who has, in this short exchange, quite clearly gone mad, which is a bit of a shame because he was a pretty upstanding guy in the original game, and over the course of the games you can sort of see his descent into full-blown madness, as he's turned into an incredibly cruel, vindictive person by the time this game rolls around. In particular, though, he is happy to simply give Geralt of Rivia the location of Junior, as he has outlived his usefulness, and Radovid is unsurprisingly going to use this to obtain a favor from you just a little bit later. Once we track down Junior, we can choose whether or not to kill the guy because he's a pretty terrible person, but also it turns out he had a phylactery that was something Ciri was here trying to get fixed, and her and Dandelion agreed to perform a heist for the sake of getting this phylactery fixed. In particular, though, the person they were robbing is actually one of the other crime bosses, which just so happens to be Dijkstra, the former Redanian spy, which forms the other portion of the main story here, as Dijkstra asks us to track down what happened to his treasure, and through that quest you'll likely try to conceal a little bit here, but this quest puts you into contact via a bunch of witch hunters in a quest with Triss, and this ultimately leads you into a conversation with a spy who can reveal what happened to Dandelion. Specifically, that he is imprisoned right now, and that in order to free him, you'd need someone to give the order like the head of the witch hunters who basically just died. But we're not completely out of luck, you see, because over the course of this investigation, we can learn about a Doppler, or a shapeshifter, who was also involved in all this, and you need to lure him out of hiding, which leads to a very ridiculous quest where you have to put on and star in a play specifically tailored to getting a sort of secret message to this Doppler and getting him to show himself. You'll get more experience and gold as a reward if you actually try to make the play good, but you can also just do a terrible job and the quest will still progress, mind you. And this Doppler or shapeshifter agrees to help you by basically arranging for Dandelion to be transferred from his prison cell in Novigrad to the city of Oxenfurt. We're going to ambush this caravan and ultimately rescue Dandelion, who gives us a little more of the story about Ciri, with it ultimately culminating in the fact that after the heist ultimately went wrong and they were caught, Ciri teleported away, which is when, of course, he got captured. So we know Ciri's not in Novigrad, and that's pretty much where this particular section of the main story wraps up. But it's not the only notable thing, as there are a lot of really cool side bits of content right around this section of the game, including what happens to the mages, and a sort of clandestine plot involving Vernon Roche, Taller, the intelligence operative from the very first game, and none other than Dijkstra. So let's talk a little bit about those. So basically, you can learn that there is actually a plot to kill Radovid, as he has gone quite insane by the three people I just mentioned, and you can assist them in tracking down one of their operatives, but mostly what you're going to do right now is simply learn of this. It's also important to mention that if you help people like Vernon Roche and Vess, that they can come to your aid a little bit later in the game, which we'll get to, which can also provide you some useful background on what happened to the Kingdom of Temeria, which was a big focus of the original games as well. But another really big piece of content is helping Triss Marigold, one of our proper romance options in the game, and we can do this by basically appealing to a local wealthy aristocrat who happens to have a son who is an alchemist, which is one of the people being rounded up and burnt at the stake. Triss basically agrees to help him and is kind of by default leading an underground movement of the mages and things and trying to secure for them a way out of the city, which is what this little subplot is all about. Now, you and Triss go to a party held by this aristocrat as a cover of sorts so that you can sneak her son out of town and lead him back to Novigrad and escape. It's also your chance to romance Triss Marigold if that's what your heart desires, but we'll talk a little more about that separately. But it's a big part of this section of the game, so I wanted to mention it here. Broadly speaking though, in terms of the Novigrad area of the game, honestly, I don't care much for a lot of the main quests here, but I do think it has a lot of the game's best side quests, if that makes sense. And that's pretty much the best part about it. But after this, we're left with only one lead to track down, which is in fact Skellige, where a big magical explosion is being investigated by none other than Yennefer, and since Geralt has regained his memories in this game, he's aware that he's known some people in Skellige for quite some time. But first we have to get there. So in Novigrad, we can secure passage with a captain who supposedly has an agreement with the sort of Viking raiders that make up Skellige's main population that allows him safe passage. But perhaps unsurprisingly, on your way to the islands of Skellige, your boat gets attacked, and you manage to fend this off only for a big storm to shipwreck you, and we wake up on the beaches of Ardskellig, the largest island in Skellige, where we can then head off to the main city to meet the major players of this particular act. Now, as far as these sort of main story sections go, this one is interesting, because Skellige is probably one of the longer areas areas in terms of all the side content you can do, but the main story section of it is actually quite small. Basically, we arrive here, we find out that the king has recently passed away, and that they'll soon be choosing a new one. Ourselves, meeting up with Yennefer, goes to a sort of feast, if you will, commemorating the late king's death, where we then also sneak around into a druid's big hideout and steal an important mask called the Mask of Ouroboros, which is something Yennefer wants. We then go speak with Croc on Crate, who is an old friend of Geralt's. So Croc here agrees to help us get the permission of the local druid who is keeping Yennefer from examining the magical explosion that has to do with Ciri, and he also asks you for help with his children. This is a big portion of the side content of Skellige, which we'll get to in a moment. But main story-wise, we just go from here to investigating that magical explosion that I mentioned, which is what we need the Mask of Ouroboros for, because after a huge disagreement with Ermion, where he specifically says they should absolutely not use that under basically any circumstances, Yennefer does it anyway, which triggers this big magical storm, and we need the mask to unveil secrets of Ciri's passing through this area. As it turns out, she was very much so the cause of the magical explosion here, and in doing this, you'll eventually find a body of a rider of the Wild Hunt, and Ermion, having calmed the storm at this point, manages to tell you that a few weeks after this happened, the Wild Hunt was also seen on another nearby island, which becomes our next focus of investigation, which simply involves us going to that island or the village where this happened and investigating the incident. The village was recently raided by the Wild Hunt, and you'll learn that the only person with information was a person they now call Craven, or a man formerly known as Skjall, who happened to have been there when the place was attacked and saw what happened with Ciri, but he went to go regain his honor, having fled from the battle, supposedly, by fighting a cursed enemy in the nearby Garden of Freya. Our job is to basically go track him down and look for information, but unfortunately, he's dead. Now, you'll also have to deal with the curse here yourself if you haven't done it already, which involves fighting a werewolf as well, but eventually you'll find Skjall's body. Yennefer utilizes a bunch of necromancy to force it to talk and explain what happened, which kills the entire sacred garden of the area in the process, and gives you a flashback to what happened here. Basically, Ciri arrived at the village after having washed up on shore, more or less, after teleporting away. When the Wild Hunt arrives looking for Ciri, her and Skjall run away as he tries to lead the Wild Hunt away from the village to keep everyone from dying. Ciri ultimately meets with the magical elf that was helping her up to this point, where they got into an argument and he magically put Ciri to sleep, which is most of what Skjall saw before it shows an image of an incredibly odd-looking beast that if you've met Uma already, you'll be familiar with. Otherwise, you get a small side quest to go find out who it is if you missed that earlier in Velen. And that pretty much wraps up the entirety of the Skellige main story.